Hi there, welcome to this week's edition of Serendipity-TV. I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon, just as always, and I hope that you're going to enjoy some of the things we're going to go over today. Before we dive in, as always again, I want to make sure that you can see me and hear me okay. So if you can see me and hear me okay, give me a thumbs up, or let me tell me where you're watching from, or some of those kinds of things, so that I'll know that the technology is working like it's supposed to. You may see I am not in my normal setting. I'm actually out of town, so that's another reason I want to double check and make sure that all the technology is working right. So, like I said, if you'll give me either a thumbs up or type in yes, or yes, I can see you, or and otherwise, we'll just play it by ear and see how it goes. It's a beautiful day here, and I am, like I said earlier, as always, happy to be here with you. This week over on the blog, okay, good deal. Got a thumbs up. All right, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. Okay, so now I can go forward without worrying about y'all being able to see me and hear me okay. So, want to remind you that if you have questions, then please do post them in the comments, and I'll be happy to answer those for you as I see them pop up. And if you think of something later, or if you're watching this as a recording, feel free to include your questions in the comments box there as well. I'll come back and answer those as I see them pop up. So, this week we did a little bit deeper dive into needlepoint stitch pathways over on the blog, and that's something that we're going to talk about a little bit more here today too. So I wanted to make sure that, like I said, that everybody can see me okay. And so now that I know you can, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you, and we will dive into talking about needlepoint stitch pathways. So let me do that really quickly. Alrighty, and now you should be able to see, like I said, over on the blog this week, I took a deeper dive into the needlepoint stitch pathways because there were some people that had some questions that they weren't sure about, and so I wanted to make sure that I did touch on this a little bit more carefully, or a little bit deeper, take a little bit deeper dive or look at it, because it is something that is really critical to you being able to read those stitch diagrams. Really, I call them stitch illustrations if they don't have numbers on them, because to me, and let me slide this up so you can see, the very first kind of pathway is the satin stitch pathway. And if you'll look at this diagram, it has the numbers on it, so that tells you where you should start and what path you should follow. That's what a stitch diagram is. A stitch diagram is like a road map that you can follow that tells you where to go. And in this case, you go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and you're creating that satin stitch pathway because of the way that the needle is moving along the canvas. You're actually working in a circular motion, and you're encasing canvas threads inside your thread as you make that stitch. So another example was the upright gobelin stitch, and that's in last week's blog post, so you can check that out over on the website too. I think, well, let's see, this is the 24th, so that would have been the 17th, October the 17th. But you can also go, in fact, let me just show you this really quickly. I'm not sure that you all maybe even know that this is here. Let me go slow. I don't want to make anybody dizzy. But if you type in here, you can type in anything that you may be. Let's just type in pathway, and then we'll come back here so that you can, whoops, I can't spell. So you can type in pathway, and it'll take you to this page that shows you this blog post as well as last week's blog post. So there's a search function on the website that you can use to help you find things when you're looking for something specific. So now let's get back over here to the this week's post. And again, satin stitch pathways are going to be the ones that you're going to find yourself using the most often. Most needlepoint stitches are going to employ this type of pathway, and the benefit to being able to identify the kind of pathway that that a particular stitch uses is to enable you to know or to choose the best one for the particular situation that you have, that you're looking at when it comes to your canvas. So, and some of that is going to have to do with what the finished use is going to be. And that's something I know those of you that have been following along with me for a while know that I always say start with the end in mind. You really, really need to know what you're going to do with your project when you finish stitching it before you actually even put a needle to the canvas, because that's going to determine so many times, well, in pretty much every single case, it's going to determine which stitches you use, which threads you use. So when you make a purchase of a canvas, think about that, and even consider, if you have an end use in mind, before you do take that plunge and do decide to purchase that canvas. Because if you buy something, I'm not saying don't buy something that just speaks to your heart, because I've done that. I've not bought something that just spoke to my heart, and then when I went back to get it later, it was gone. But it always is really helpful to know just what the general path for this particular project is going to be, whether it's going to be a pillow or a stand-up, or if it's going to be framed. All of those things you just need to, to have in the back of your mind, so that when you do begin to choose different threads and stitches for that project, you're going to be doing that in a way that's going to be compatible with the finished use of the piece. So, now that I've done that, I've given you that little spiel, let me get off my soapbox, and we'll keep moving along to the running stitch pathways. Something that I'd like to suggest that you do too is to get yourself a doodle canvas. And when I say doodle canvas, that's just a piece of blank canvas. And I usually make mine 8 inches by 8 inches, and then attach it to some stretcher bars and practice these pathways. Just get some scrap thread out of your stash and practice these pathways so that you can become familiar with them, because it's going to really help you in the long run to be able to identify the different options that you have. And when you have a stitch book that doesn't have numbers on it, if you're familiar with these pathways, then you're going to be able to look at the stitches and look at the individual. So many times you have a stitch that's a combination stitch or a composite stitch, and that means it's made up of more than one kind of stitch. And sometimes, you have layered stitches. So if you can dissect the stitch, the illustration, and then understand the composition of it, that's going to help you determine which pathway you should follow in order to get the best outcome. So the next one is the running stitch pathway, and this is very, very straightforward, just like it sounds. What you're doing is you're taking your needle in and out through the canvas, up and down, in a forward moving or forward progressing motion, and it's just like a running stitch, exactly like it sounds. There is a stitch called the running stitch in embroidery, and that's what we're doing is canvas embroidery. So a running stitch is, like I said, it's an embroidery stitch, but it's also a pathway. It's a direction that the stitch is following, or that your motion is taking. Now, that's something that I want to come back and I guess focus on again for just a minute, and that is that the pathway is the direction you take, or the steps that you follow to get from the beginning to the end. So there's a difference, and I'm going to jump back over here and look at you again. So there is a difference between a pathway and traveling or a travel thread. And so let's just do a little quick review of that. The pathway is the sequence in which you actually execute the portions of the stitch. The travel or traveling is the act of carrying your thread across the back of the canvas from one area to another, and the travel thread is the actual thread itself. So those three things, or those three definitions, are pretty critical to your understanding of reading stitch diagrams, following stitch diagrams, understanding the way stitches are put together and how you're best going to execute them on your canvas. So just make sure that you get those things clear in your head. And I think I did reiterate that here, but I did give you the definitions for those in last week's blog post. So you might want to go back and take a peek at that too, like I said, if you hadn't done that already, because that's a really good place to start. And then this week we'll just go a little bit deeper into what we talked about last week. So and there is, I'm not sure, come to think of it, I'm not sure that I did upload last week's episode of Serendipity TV to our YouTube channel. If I didn't, I'll do that tonight. And then I'll also get this uploaded to YouTube tonight too, so you can go back and watch that there too, if you'd like to do that. So, all right, so let's share the screen again. And here we go. So the next one is a double running stitch pathway. Now this is a little bit more complex than the first two. And the reason I say that is because a double running stitch pathway is one in which a single row of stitches is actually worked in two passes. You go across and back to complete the row. So if you look at this, this is an alternating oblong cross. Alternating in this sense is that the stitch units alternate on the row. And a question that somebody had was, what's the difference between the stitches that are pink and those that are blue? And the short answer is that's to show you the difference between two rows. When I do a stitch diagram, I like to make sure that you can see the difference between one row and the next. Sometimes if things are all the same color, they get mixed up in your mind, and it's easier to see the difference between two different rows if they're two different colors. So in this case, row 1 is blue, and you can see that you start at number 1, go to number 2, then you go down to down to number 3 and up to number 4, then 5 to 6, 7 to 8. So we're alternating up and down, and then to finish those cross stitches, we're going to turn around and come back the other direction. We started on the left side and worked our way to the right. To finish that row of stitches, we're going to go from right to left. So we go from 15 to 16, 17 to 18, 19 to 20, 21 to 22, and so on. When you finish that row, then you drop down and you repeat the same process on the next row. So that's what I mean when I say a row is executed in two passes. You go across and back to complete that row. All righty. Now, let's look down here and talk a minute or two about the backstitch pathway. So, the backstitch pathway is another kind of pathway that's also named after a particular stitch. There is a backstitch in needlepoint and in surface embroidery, and this follows the exact same path as a backstitch. It's kind of hard to know, was the pathway named after the stitch, or was the stitch named after the pathway? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but regardless of which came first, we do know by looking at this that when you start with number 1 and then go to number 2, you're going to be going back over here to number 3, coming down to number 4. Then you're going to go back to number 5 and then take your needle to the back of your canvas at number 6. And when you're going from left to right, you're just going to reverse the direction, and you're going to go 7 to 8, 9 to 10, 11 to 12. And I've got those numbers backwards, so I've got to fix that. Whoops. Sorry about that. So that's my boo-boo. But one thing you want to keep in mind when you're working this kind of a stitch pathway, a little tip, is to use a chenille needle, and that's spelled Chenille. It's a pointed needle, and it will pierce the thread, and that's what you want to do, because you want to pierce that thread to hold that thread in place so that those stitches stay nice and straight. So a tapestry needle what would happen is if you used a tapestry needle, when you went down into the canvas, the thread that is on the back side would either go to the needle would go either to the above it or below it. It wouldn't pierce it, and so it wouldn't secure it in place, and it wouldn't keep those stitches on the front side of your canvas nice and straight and secure. So that's just a little tip. Then moving along, you've got the running back stitch pathway, and this is a composite pathway. This is really a combination of the running stitch pathway and the back stitch pathway. And you can see here that let me back up here. I need to make a note to, I'm going to jump down here. I forgot to do this. The back stitch, I need to fix my diagram. I don't want to confuse anybody. Let me write that down. Okay. All right, done. Okay, so the running back stitch pathway is such that you have part of it is the running portion and the other part is the back portion. So you can see here 1 to 2 is the running portion. The easiest way is to just look at the diagram and follow along. And then you go over to 3 and you come back to 4. So that's the back portion. Then 5 to 6 is the running portion. Over here 7 to 8 is the back portion. And this stitch is actually, if you consider the overall stitch pattern, you have 2 pathways in, and this is one of those cases that I was talking about earlier, where when you have a stitch that's the combination stitch, you're going to have more than one pathway most of the time. So here you can see that we have the satin pathway, and the satin pathway would be, what you do to execute this part of the stitch, the vertical part of the stitch, and then the slanted or diagonal parts of the stitch you would work in the running back pathway. Judy asked a question. She says, when you mention piercing the thread, do you mean splitting the thread by coming up through it? And yes, I do. That's exactly what I mean. What happens when you have a pointed needle, you can do that. You can pierce the thread, and what that does is it secures it in place so that it stays there and your stitches are well, for lack of a better word, secure. They're not going to wobble around. So that's that's one of the benefits to using that chenille needle. Okay, and then finally the conservative stitch pathway, which is exactly what it sounds like. When you conservative means to conserve means to save, and so what you have in this particular case is the least amount of thread of all the possibilities on the back side of the canvas. So, and the example I used here is the half cross tent stitch. So the half cross tent stitch is the one that uses the least amount of thread of all 3 tent stitch variations. You have half cross, continental, and diagonal tent, which is also called basket weave. So the half cross, if you look at the back of the half cross, and I'm going to jump back on camera and look at y'all again now. Y'all are probably tired of looking at just a screen. When you have the half cross stitch, when you flip it over on the back, when you've worked a piece in half cross stitch, the back, you see a bunch of little vertical stitches. So that's using the least amount of thread of all 3 tent stitch variations. The one that uses the most is the diagonal tent stitch or basket weave. And if you've done much work with basket weave, you know that it creates, the reason it's called basket weave is because it creates a mesh of interwoven threads on the back side that does look like a woven basket. It's the most durable of all forms of tent stitch, and it also uses the most amount of thread, or the most thread. Continental is the one that looks like long slanted stitches on the back side. So you have those 3 different variations of tent stitch, and the half cross and continental are worked in horizontal or vertical rows, and then basket weave also, typically I guess the official or the technical term for it is diagonal tent, and it's worked in diagonal rows. So, all right, so Judy, I'm glad I answered your question, and hi Alice, glad to have you here. So let me make sure that I have gone through everything I wanted to make sure that I was going to touch on. I did want to make sure that I let you know, of course, the book that I mentioned last week, Lone Star Stitches, great book. yeah, I highly recommend it, especially if you've been doing needlepoint for a while and using decorative stitches. Got lots and lots of wonderful stitch possibilities in there. And one of the best ways that you can learn about the different stitch pathways is to just practice. You know, that old adage, how do you get, or that old, what is it, that old saying, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. Well, that's true with needlepoint too. The best way that you can become more confident with your needlepoint, with your stitches, with your ability to choose stitches, with your ability to choose threads, is to just dive in there with abandon and give it a whirl. And know that the worst thing that can happen is that you learn that that doesn't work. And instead of it being a failure, look at it as a lesson learned. You learned something that you didn't know before, and you can just take that knowledge and go forward with it, and then, you know, just learn from doing is just really my best advice that I can give you. Something else I want to remind you of, because I think so many of us get caught up in the fact that, you know, there are technical ways to do things. Yes, there are correct ways to do things when it comes to needlepoint, canvas embroidery, any kind of craft. There are guidelines and things that do, I guess, what's the right way to say this, that there is a basic skill set that you need to have, and you need to know how to do things correctly. But it's also an art form, and don't forget that. There shouldn't be, at least not in the world, and not in my world, not in the Serendipity Needleworks world. There's not going to be anybody who's going to come and crack your knuckles with a ruler and say, you can't do that, because this is also an art form, and it's your project, it's your piece of art. You're creating something that appeals to you, that expresses your own unique creativity. So don't let anybody quash that by telling you you're doing something wrong. Now, yes, there are ways that make it easier, that make your stitching easier, that give you better results than others, but yeah, just don't let people beat you down. That's going to be my message for the day. Don't let people, don't let people make you feel bad about what you're doing, because in the end, this is a hobby, and we're supposed to be having fun. And that is, if I can't make you see anything else, is that needlepoint is supposed to be fun. And so that's, we do this for enjoyment, and we do it for relaxation. And so, yeah, I just want you to keep having fun, and just let your imagination run wild when you work on your projects, and test things out on doodle canvases, and know that that's, you're going to learn by doing. You're just going to expand your horizons by trying out new things. And, there is no set in stone thing that says you have to do it this way. You can do it however you want to do, and as long as you're happy with the end product. So now, I know there are needlepoint judges out there who would say, oh my gosh, I can't believe she just said that. Okay, so if you are going to be doing something for judging purposes, then yes, there are guidelines and things that you have to follow. But if you're doing this just for fun, just have fun. Okay, now, so I think that I need to get off that soapbox too. And it is almost 3:30. I'm about to jump over inside the Stitchers Club Facebook group, and we're going to chat a little bit today about some things that we've been doing over there. So I will see all of you who are in the Stitchers Club inside the Stitchers Club Facebook group at 4 o'clock Central Time. Yesterday, I totally botched our monthly Q&A session time. It was supposed to be 4, and I was so eager to see y'all, I started at 3. So we'll answer questions there inside the Facebook group too. But I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be here with me this afternoon. We will not have a broadcast next week, but we will pick back up on November the 7th, and I have some exciting news that I'll be sharing with you at that time. and I will look forward to seeing you week after next. Alice, thank you so much for sending the heart for Hearts for Hospice. If anybody has any questions about that project, please feel free to send me an email at ellen@serendipityneedleworks.com, or send me a private message, or you can just ask a question here on the Facebook page. I'm happy to help however I can, and I just want to make sure that that project continues to thrive and benefits as many families as it possibly can. So Alice, I thank you tremendously for your generous gift, and I look forward to receiving that. So hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Until next time, which will be week after next, happy stitching. Make sure you take some time to put a stitch or two in a canvas, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.